Yo, this is for everybody that was not here the other day, seeing that I've only seen cohort B by, or at least once in the last few days. First thing that we did was try and decipher a little bit the differences between the French and the American revolutions. Um, oh, I hit something. Sorry. Bring it. All right. Um, So with the American Revolution, sorry, I'm trying to draw with a little tool here, right? We have both of them starting. We'll do B for beginning, right? They both begin for the issue of taxes, um, but a little bit different here because the American Revolution starts because they basically had been getting away with not paying taxes for roughly 150 years under the policy of salutary neglect. And then when they were forced to start paying their taxes after the 7 Years' War, they felt that that was outrageous. Further, they had been smuggling under mercantilism, which they were only supposed to trade with their home country of England, and they'd actually been smuggling quite a bit. They continued to do so even after policies had said to do otherwise, and so they began to rebel because of that. And that mostly happened in northeastern ports. French Rev also fights for taxes, but their main thing is political. They want political reform more than anything else, because as we know, roughly about 1% of the 28 million people that lived in France at that time actually had any political say under absolute monarchy. Further, at the beginning, it's an absolute monarchy. Let's do absolute M, which is quite different than having colonial governments, right? So that's step one. Also, what we need to do is do a little political spectrum here, right? So if we do increasingly liberal on the right and extremely conservative on the right, so right to left to right spectrum here, and I'll draw a little line. And then for the sake of ease, we'll use the US here as our middle ground approach, right? As a Republican-based democracy, right? I'll change colors with the pen. Let's do Great Britain and the US colonies, right? So Britain already had a constitutional monarchy, so it's not absolute. So I'd say we'll put it between US and then any conservative government that existed at the time, right? So this would be England here, right? And its colonies. So the British colonies or the American colonies ended up moving from this middle ground approach to about halfway to where we are today. Because again, we know that roughly only 10 to 15% of the populace end up actually having any sort of voting and political power by the revolution's end in the formation of the Constitution, right? Let's switch colors again. We'll do green, even though it has nothing to do with the French Rev. So we'll do F for France. They start all the way on the conservative line here, under absolute monarchy, arguably tyranny, where there is complete political oppression, except if you are a noble, and even then you don't have any say. So they went from that approach all the way over to the far left for the time, because this is prior to socialism and communism, right? So they went as far left as you can, at one point having near pure democracy. And then ultimately, what we're talking about today is came back to it's a weird line, maybe just a little bit more conservative than England was at the time under Napoleon. All right. And what we're going to do now is actually write some timelines here in terms of the shift. All right. So when we're over by F here, we're looking at pre 1789. Right. Sorry, I'm trying to draw with the mouse here, guys. So pre 1789. From 1789 to about 1791, they begin experimenting with constitutional monarchy. And quite frankly, Louis XVI might be the world's biggest idiot because he threw away a wonderful palace because he felt like he needed more power, right? Then what happens from 1791 until about late 1792-93, as they're waging revolutionary wars on the western and northern borders of France. They become the National Convention. So I'll do NAT convention. And they start putting in policies to increase membership in their government. Political parties develop, all of that cool jazz, right? Then they quickly move all the way to the left, but become a leftist dictatorship under Maximilien Robespierre. And that lasts for about a year and a half. So we'll say 1794, all right? They quickly make a retreat back to the middle ground, arguably where this little circle is here. I know it looks a little messy, but again, this is a video, so it'll be nice and slow. So right around here, they come back under the Directory, which lasts roughly about 5 years. That's that 5-member board. I had you guys do a reading on that. So that's 94 to about 99, or just until the rise of Napoleon, right? I'll give Napoleon his own fancy schmancy color in bright blue. And from 99 all the way until about 1815, we have a weird middle ground where there's some liberal policy, but some conservative approaches, because we know Napoleon's an emperor, but at the same time, he did uphold some ideals of the French Rev. So absolute chaos. Okay, then we have this other image here. We have Napoleon in the early portion of his career, clearly thinking he's awesome, completely ignoring the fact that he's below average height, though by not much, seeing that he's bigger than the horse. And then we have, if I can take out the previews for this one, as you guys will see, we have Napoleon looking like a melted ice cream cone. Clearly not doing so great, probably in exile. Napoleon was Corsican, which is actually a tiny island that had been passed from an Italian kingdom of Genoa to France. And people there were pretty upset. They spoke Italian and Corsican, and they were mostly nationalists. So they didn't want to be under French rule. They wanted to be their own independent place. And Napoleon believed in that his entire life, which is kind of ironic, seeing that he went from becoming a Corsican nationalist who barely spoke French to becoming the Emperor of France. He's insanely bright, and he's from a basically middle stage of wealth for that island's nobility level. He probably wouldn't have been as wealthy as any of the first or second estate members in France, but he certainly had a favorable upbringing. Both of his parents were tied to other individuals of wealth, so they always had backup plans. He was increasingly radical as he grew up, seeing he's about in his early 20s, around the early 1790s, when the revolution was taking place. And had it never taken place, there probably would be another Napoleon, because institutions weren't founded on meritocracy. They didn't actually take the best individuals. It was blatant nepotism or political favors. So he never would have been able to get into the École Militaire, which is their military academy. He was the first non-Frenchman to technically graduate from that institution. Here's a famous quote: "Since one must take sides, one might as well choose a side that is victorious, the side which devastates, loots, and burns. Considering the alternative, it is better to eat than be eaten. Do not play Monopoly with Napoleon. He will not be cool. He will certainly screw you over throughout the entire game." It's something interesting to consider, because he originally was a radical, but then when Maximilien Robespierre, one of his idols, was finally beheaded at the end of the Reign of Terror, he miraculously switched sides and was able to find a way to sift throughout the bureaucracy of the revolutionary government and escape political persecution. So, from about 1793 to 1796, we see him moving around from department to department, mostly within the military, um, because the revolution didn't know quite what to do with him. He's way too smart and valuable to give up, especially militarily, but he's also a dangerous individual that is extremely self interested. So, he could be an amazing tool or a weapon, um, or enemy of the revolution, especially the moderates. His early campaign were in the northern parts of Italy. So northern Italy was considered the kingdom of Italy, and then the bottom half was not part of the unified peninsula quite yet. He took over Italy in about 2.5 weeks, a place that former generals had struggled to take control of. Um, so he's leading that group, and he's able to get about 45 to 57 million dollars in about 2 weeks by essentially looting northern Italy. While he's there, he abolishes serfdom. He allows religious freedom, and he gets rid of noble privileges. So he seems to be a hero of the common man and the common person. Afterwards, he starts moving his way up through Austria, which I'll draw a little line here for you guys. So he literally worked his way down through and then up into Austria, which was a pretty crazy man move back then, seeing that the Holy Roman Empire was the continental power of the time and had friends such as Prussia and Italian states and Russia as well. So if you were able to fight Austria and make them sue for peace, you were certainly making a name for yourself. So by outdoing the continental power of the time, he was able to get Holland, Belgium, northern Italy, a variety of islands, and then he also was able to work his way in on Western Germany's free cities and states, which we'll talk about later on in the year. His next campaign doesn't go quite as well, so he wanted to economically wage war against Great Britain because they were um, spread out globally, but to actually invade the British homeland is incredibly hard, where they have the world's strongest navy at the time, something they were able to boast about for about 350 years. So he decided to try and take Egypt away from Egypt because Egypt's main um, source of income was producing and controlling all aspects of the Indian economy, right? So if you can control Egypt, you're cutting off trade routes for England, and they'll have to sail around the entirety of Africa, which would greatly increase shipping times. And so Napoleon wanted to basically control Egypt, which would in turn, along with their holdings now in northern Italy, and then they already have the French coast, would allow them basically to consolidate their control throughout the Mediterranean, a major hubbub for Europe. Initially, it goes well while he's in the Nile basins, but then um, as he started working his way up through Galilee and then the areas that are now considered Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, he loots and burns without any regard for humanity. England sends their own admiral, Horatio Nelson, down, who actually destroys the French at the Battle of the Nile. In doing this, Nelson becomes a hero for England and also will later on battle Napoleon again. And Napoleon flees, leaving many of his troops to either be taken hostage by the British Army, killed by the British Army or the locals, or die of bubonic plague. Because there's no Twitter and news was relatively slow, Napoleon was able to return back to France and control the narrative and receive a hero's welcome amongst the general populace, even though the Directory knew that he had basically abandoned his men. Just a quick map of what the world looks like at this time, something that we ended up drawing the other day. So when we had France prior to the revolution, it was just within this red square, right? right, or whatever you call it, shape. After Napoleon starts fighting for the French, he extends their holdings into this blue line, essentially, right? This blue area, and then further down south, and starts eyeing this portion of the world. By the time or the peak of his reign, he has pretty much everywhere in the Mediterranean, in continental Europe, except for Great Britain, creating a continental system to diplomatically isolate any and all individuals. That he doesn't make every place called France. What he does is he puts his brothers or his friends into positions of power and have them act as essentially puppet emperors. Though what ends up happening is when he starts struggling to consolidate control in Portugal and Spain, he's also simultaneously trying to move his way in through Russia, and he has to split his forces. So Spain and Portugal forced him to keep some of his um, best soldiers and generals and resources down south, while also trying to invade Russia in the winter, which is something my history class will tell you never ever to do, because it gets so insanely cold that you can't figure out what's going on. And they'll burn their own cities and their own crops so you starve in the cold, and then when you retreat, they'll pick you off. And so by the time he had done that, he'd been gone for just enough time that France was able to turn against him, and other political powers within Paris, Versailles, Toulouse, Lyon, and Savoy were able to figure out a way to oust Napoleon, seeing that his leadership had become a little erratic. When he actually came to power, he called himself the First Consul, which was Julius Caesar's title. He, like the Directory, actually came in as a coup with 5 other individuals. So it was him, his brother Lucian, that rigged the elections for him. Abbassiez, the individual that wrote What is the Third Estate about 10 years earlier, um, supports Napoleon and helps him get there. One of the directors from the government supported his cause. That was Joseph Fouché. And then he had another general help him. Eventually, he would become an emperor in 1804 and serve under that role with strict censorship till his reign's end. Under the consulate or his government structure, he had a council of the state that proposed laws, and they served as the cabinet in the highest court. They were also the ones that were able to negotiate and deal with Napoleon head on. The tribune debated laws, but they were not allowed to vote on them. The legislature was the individuals that would vote on the laws, but never discussed or debated them. Their sole job was to hear out arguments, not discuss, and then vote. And then there was a Senate, so like a last chance review, essentially, that could veto any legislation that got that far. He established central banking, which we've talked about to an extent in my honors class. I'll be drawing a map on the board and show you guys some econ materials about why having centralized banking is essential for controlling inflation, the value of currency, and the price of goods and commodities and services. By doing that, he started to combat the decades of debt and interest that France had to pay off to its own citizens into foreign nations. To battle back the wrongs of the revolution, so the revolution had the constitution of the clergy. That had actually turned many individuals off from the revolution. His way of trying to amend the wrongs and try and get some of the more conservative individuals of France to align with his rule. He had tried finding a middle ground solution between the First Estate prior to the revolution and then the way that they had functioned under the revolution. So he gave them some of the lands back, but not all, and he made sure that he was in charge. Initially, the Pope actually agreed with what he had done, but when he realized that he wasn't doing this from a religious standpoint, but more from a political means, the Pope ended up delegitimizing this concordat. And because Napoleon feared the repercussions, he simply imprisoned the Pope. Now, the Concord of 1801, it declared that Catholicism was the religion of the majority of the Frenchmen. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be any other religion, but it was the preferred, I guess. The Pope had to accept that any lands in France, not abroad, but in the specifics of France that were lost during the Revolution had to remain that way and were given back to the people. And it also brought bishops under the control of Napoleon and his regime, that they had to answer to him and the government, not the Pope. Um, and that this is something that rulers have been trying to do for an extremely long time, that to battle with the church for political control. The last bit here before we stop is the lycée system of education, which basically, taking the concept of meritocracy ever so further, the lycée system tried to basically find pockets of students that were incredibly talented through national tests. And though they had to pay tuition, there were scholarships for those that were financially unable to pay their way. And these lycees were institutions that were liberal arts based that tried to get individuals to be trained purposely to serve in the government. Um, and this is we can see this as a reactionary means from popular voting that had gone on in the French Rev, especially in the Reign of Terror, and as a way of avoiding the nepotism that had functioned under feudalism. So this is some sort of middle ground approach where you do have to prove your worth, but it's based on inherent talent and hard work, not simply being able to rouse individuals through oratory speeches or pamphlets, um, or because your dad, fortunately, is some sort of feudal noble. So there's a middle ground solution here that Napoleon had developed. And then in class, when I do finally see you guys, we're going to be breaking down the Napoleonic Code, which had taken thousands and thousands of laws, simplified them, and broken them down, discussing personal status of who are citizens and who are not, what is property and how much of it you can control, how you can acquire it, and ensuring freedom of religion, freedom of expression to an extent, so long as you're not speaking out against him. Though some of the ideals were certainly very liberal, his views regarding women were not. So we're going to actually be evaluating whether or not his Napoleonic Code that was spread throughout Europe promoted values of the French Revolution or combated and hurt the ideas the French Revolution had tried to spread.